David was sitting in his car when he opened his banking app for the third time that week. He already knew what it would say. He just kept checking anyway. $12,400. He stared at the number, but that afternoon it looked different. He'd just spent 20 minutes comparing his life to people who seemed to have figured everything out before they were 30. Suddenly, that number felt less like a number and more like a verdict. So he did something he already knew was going to make him feel worse. He opened YouTube. A guy in his 20s was explaining how he planned to retire with millions. Another video showed what $500 a month could become if you invested it long enough. Then another. David watched for a few seconds. Then he opened a compound interest calculator and entered his own numbers. That's when the $12,400 started to feel a lot smaller, because the calculator didn't care that he'd spent the last 20 years raising a family. It didn't care about the years when money was tight. It didn't care that sometimes saving simply wasn't an option. It didn't care about the things that had happened between 24 and 44. It just showed him what his money could have become if he'd started 20 years earlier. And for the first time, David wasn't thinking about how much he had. He was thinking about how much time he'd lost. And that's where David was about to make his biggest financial mistake: not starting late. Believing that starting late meant he had to play catch-up. The next morning, David started doing the math again. He looked at his income, his expenses, his savings, and the years he had left to invest. The conclusion seemed obvious. He needed to save more, invest more, and somehow make up for the 20 years he'd already lost. So that's what he started doing. He cut back on things he enjoyed. He looked at every expense as money that could have been invested. A dinner became an investment he wasn't making. A weekend away became money he could have saved. Even small purchases started to feel irresponsible. He started thinking about working longer, taking more risk, and pushing everything else further down the list. It sounded responsible. And that's what made it dangerous, because nobody had told him to do anything reckless. He was simply trying to be responsible 20 years too late. But slowly, something changed. He wasn't building a financial plan anymore. He was trying to repay a debt he owed to his younger self. Every time he compared his numbers to someone who had started investing in their 20s, he felt further behind. And the further behind he felt, the more aggressively he wanted to catch up. Until one night, staring at the same spreadsheet, he finally stopped. What exactly am I trying to catch up to? And then came the harder question. If I finally reach that number, what do I actually get? Because maybe David wasn't really chasing $1 million. Maybe he was chasing what he thought $1 million would give him, and that was something much simpler: control. That night, David was sitting at the kitchen table while his wife went through the mail. There was a bill on the table, nothing unusual, a couple $100. A few years earlier, that kind of bill would have meant moving something around, maybe putting it on a card, maybe delaying something else, maybe telling himself he'd deal with it next month. This time, they could pay it. David looked at the bill for a second, then put it aside, and it made him realize something he'd completely missed. He'd been so focused on the number he was missing that he'd stopped noticing what the money he already had was actually doing for him. He wasn't rich. He wasn't anywhere close to where he thought he should be. He still had a long way to go, but things were starting to feel a little different. An unexpected expense didn't automatically become a crisis. He had a little more room to make decisions. And maybe that's what he'd been trying to buy all along. Not $1 million. Room to breathe. Room to say no. Room to leave a bad situation without immediately wondering how the bills would get paid. He'd always imagined financial freedom as the moment when he could finally stop working. The beach, the house, the big retirement account. Some imaginary day when money would finally stop being something he had to think about. But sitting there at the kitchen table, he started wondering if freedom actually began much earlier than that. Maybe it wasn't a finish line. Maybe it was something you built piece by piece every time you made your life a little less fragile. And for the first time, David stopped asking how much money he needed to catch up. He asked a different question: what would make my life feel less fragile? But knowing what he wanted wasn't enough. He still had $12,400. He was still 44, and he couldn't go back and change any of that. So now he had to figure out what to do with the life he actually had. A few days later, David sat down and looked at his expenses again. This time, he wasn't trying to figure out how far behind he was. He was looking for the things that kept him dependent on every paycheck: the car payment, the credit card balance he'd been carrying, the subscriptions he barely used, the expenses that seemed harmless on their own but together had become an expensive way of living. And then he noticed something he'd completely missed before. He'd been thinking about investing as if it were the only way out. Every time he felt behind, his instinct was to put more money into investments, more risk, more growth, more pressure to make the numbers move. But before his money could start working for him, he needed to stop so much of it from working against him. The problem was he couldn't do everything at once. He couldn't aggressively pay down debt, build a cash cushion, invest as much as possible, and keep living exactly the same way. Something had to change, so he stopped trying to do everything. He paid down the debt, he built some cash, he looked for ways to earn a little more instead of trying to squeeze every last dollar out of the life he already had. And once there was actually something left over, he invested it. It wasn't a dramatic transformation. There was no morning where David woke up and suddenly felt financially secure. Some months were still frustrating. Some expenses still surprised him. There were still moments when he looked at his account and thought, this isn't enough. But at least now he knew what he was doing and why. And that mattered because he wasn't making decisions from panic anymore. He was building in an order that made sense for his actual life. None of this felt exciting. There was no stock that doubled overnight, no secret strategy, no dramatic moment where David suddenly became wealthy. But then something happened that mattered more than any of that. A few months later, his car needed an expensive repair. A few years earlier, that bill would have gone straight onto a credit card. This time, David paid it. He didn't move another bill. He didn't panic. He didn't spend the next 3 weeks wondering how he was going to recover. He just paid it. And when he got home that night, he realized something. The money wasn't making him rich yet. It was making him harder to break. And that was the first time he understood that starting late doesn't necessarily mean you need a more complicated strategy. It means you need a strategy built around the life you actually have. A year went by. David's life didn't suddenly look different from the outside. He still went to work. He still had bills. There were still things he couldn't afford without thinking about them. He wasn't driving a new car. He wasn't posting screenshots of some enormous investment account. If you met him on the street, you probably wouldn't have noticed anything. But there was one difference. He had stopped checking his bank account with that same feeling in his stomach. He didn't feel rich. He just didn't feel trapped. Then one Friday afternoon, his boss asked him to stay late again. It wasn't unusual. In fact, it was the kind of thing David had been putting up with for years. The old David would have immediately said yes, not because he wanted to, because he needed the paycheck. He looked at the clock. Then he thought about the money he'd saved, the debt he'd paid down, and the cushion he'd built. And for the first time, he realized something. He could say no, not because he was wealthy, not because he could afford to quit tomorrow, just because saying no wouldn't destroy him. So he told his boss he couldn't stay, and then he walked out. Nothing dramatic happened. Nobody applauded. He didn't suddenly feel like he'd won at life. He just got into his car and drove home, but halfway there he realized he was smiling. Because for the first time, money hadn't made the decision for him. And that night, driving home, David started thinking about what he'd spent so many years calling financial freedom. He'd always imagined a number. $1 million, maybe two, enough money that he could finally stop worrying. But what if there was no number big enough to guarantee that? What if every time he reached one number, he'd simply move the finish line a little further away? Maybe enough wasn't the amount that let him buy everything he wanted. Maybe it was the amount that gave him choices. Because that afternoon, David had experienced something that had nothing to do with becoming rich. He'd experienced the ability to say no without being terrified of what would happen next. And maybe that's what he'd been trying to build all along. Not a perfect retirement, not some imaginary version of his life if he'd started investing at 22, just enough freedom that money stopped making every decision for him. The next 10 years weren't about David trying to become the person he'd been at 24. They were about making the life he actually had a little less fragile year after year. He kept investing. He kept improving his finances. He made more money where he could. He avoided turning every raise into a bigger lifestyle. And slowly, almost boringly, the numbers started moving. By 55, he still wasn't a millionaire, but his debt was gone. His savings had grown. His investments were working quietly in the background. And more importantly, he had choices. Then one day, the company announced a restructuring. 10 years earlier, an email like that would have sent David into panic. He would have immediately started calculating how long his savings would last, how quickly he could find another job, which bills he could postpone, whether he'd need to borrow money. This time, he read the email twice. He wasn't happy about it. He wasn't suddenly financially independent, but he knew something he hadn't known at 44. He'd be okay. And that's when David finally understood what all those boring decisions had actually been building. Not just a bigger account balance, not just a better retirement, control over what happened next. And once you start looking at money that way, your entire financial life starts to look different. The question isn't only, how much should I have by now? It's, what can I build with the time I still have? Because maybe David really was late. Maybe if he'd started at 24, his life would look different today. There's no point pretending otherwise. Starting earlier would have helped. But David finally understood something even more important. He couldn't invest in the years he'd lost. He could only invest in the years he still had. And for the first time, those years didn't feel like a countdown. They felt like a beginning.